Running virtual teams or hybrid teams whose members are all over the world is a topic that comes up more and more often in my intercultural executive coaching career. It seems that the last couple of years have turned the world upside down and then upside down again for leaders who are responsible for companies, teams, and projects that span across countries, continents, and cultures. First of all, the pandemic forced these leaders to engage people and to work with their teams by technological means. And then when the pandemic ended, it almost looked like we can resume work as it was before, but then very soon we found out that too much happened in terms of technology and in the world economy and supply chains and management methods. So we cannot really go back. We have to learn to work with a system that is put together from pre- and post-pandemic ways. If this wasn't enough, then as the world resumed after the pandemic and people started traveling again, leaders had to resume traveling as well, going to conferences, meetings, and simply just keeping in touch in person with their teams all over the world. Now, these changes put an enormous burden on leaders who are in charge of teams that span across 3, 4, 5, or even 10 time zones. And one mistake that these leaders make is that they try to work with these teams on a personal level exactly the way that they used to work with teams who were in the same space. So today we are going to look at how a leader can stay productive, can stay motivated, or in some cases even stay sane while working with people across multiple time zones that span across half the globe. I will share with you something I noticed about the structure of international teams and projects that span multiple time zones that make it easier for a leader to decide when to step in and engage people on a personal level, even by virtual means, and when to step back and delegate these responsibilities to people on the local level. I'm going to share with you a couple of examples and recommendations based on my 20+ year coaching experience between East and West. Finally, at the end of the video, I will share with you a couple of resources, among others, a book that I have found extremely useful while I was working with international executives on similar topics. My name is Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership coach and consultant, supporting senior executives in intercultural skills, both in Asia and in Europe. Some challenges of working across multiple time zones are very obvious from the very beginning. For example, imagine somebody who works, let's say, in a European headquarter, but on a project that also involves Chinese, Southeast Asian, and let's say another location in the American continent like the United States or Mexico. The first thing, which is fairly obvious, is that the leader must be on duty almost 24/7 if they want to engage with all of the teams and all of the activities, let's say participate in video meetings in all of these locations. Another challenge, which is quite obvious, is technology. So first of all, a lot of senior leaders are not very young, let's say in their 40s, 50s, or even 60s, already not very comfortable with interacting with people using technology. But then each of these locations would have their preferred technologies. In some of these places, people tend and prefer to deal with business issues through email, some of them through chat modules or video calls, and even these apps are completely different, especially if these locations include places like Southeast Asia, China, or Russia. Some other challenges, they are a little bit more nuanced. Leaders typically discover them a little bit later, and they go much deeper into the cultural differences between locations. One of them is the issue of languages. Although most international projects work in either English or another major business language towards the top, as tasks and responsibilities cascade down, eventually people start working in a regional language or a national language that they prefer to use. Beyond language, people also have different attitudes towards things like speed, accuracy, and what is considered polite and impolite behavior when they interact with each other, including in the cyberspace. Imagine a project that involves, let's say, Germany, Thailand, and the United States of America. When people go on a video meeting or when they email each other, they would have pretty different ideas about how fast you are supposed to reply an email, how timely you should be when you join a meeting, what is considered honest feedback, what is considered rude, and what is considered kind of hazy indirect communication that people don't really get. One of the usual problems with consultants trying to make improvements on these issues for companies is that they start from the bottom up, basically as if the company didn't exist. They try to give advice on what kind of organizational structure the company should use, what kind of information technology is the best in situations like this, and who the people should be in these teams that are scattered all over the world. The problem is that leaders who face these issues seldom can choose all or even any of these factors. They cannot reinstall the IT system of the company. They have very little influence on how to change legacy structures, legacy leadership methods in the company, and most of the people are already in place. But even if they cannot change the organizational structure of the company, the IT system of the company, or the people, or at least most of the people in the teams involved, leaders can still do a lot to improve collaboration, communication, and effectiveness in teams that span across half the world and many time zones. When I start working with executives as a coach, I usually start from self-awareness and awareness about human nature, about how people usually work with each other, and then we go on to some more practical things about the organization of the team and daily practices. So this is the way I am going to proceed in this video as well. I'm going to start with how teams usually work, how international projects and teams are usually structured, and that is going to be the clue to practical solutions. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how executives I work with apply these concepts in daily leadership practice. The first thing I would like you to notice is that even though the technical tools that connect projects, people, teams across several locations and several time zones promise us a kind of culture-free, easy to work with, uniform environment where people can collaborate, those people still do most of their work and most of their interactions locally in different cultures, and cultural differences have an enormous influence on how those people look at each other, how they look at work, and how they look at a supervisor who might be thousands of miles away. They structure their working days differently. If we take the example that I shared with you just now, in some of these places such as Germany, people tend to work from 9 to 5 very diligently with very few breaks. But at the end of the day, when let's say 5 or 6 o'clock or 6:30, when they put down work, they wave bye-bye and they don't want to hear about work anymore. It's very difficult to get hold of them. People in the United States or in China are much more flexible with their time. Typically, they are willing to put in extra hours as long as they decide that the work requires it. But even between these locations, you are going to find significant differences. Whereas busy Americans have a tendency to have lunch on the run, Asian people almost never eat in a hurry. And in some places, you will even find it difficult to catch people right after lunch in countries like China or Indonesia, because people have a nap laying down on their tables. People have different attitudes to language as well, whose challenges are fairly similar to the ones you can experience with technology. English is a language that we can use all across the world for business purposes, but some people are very comfortable with the flat character of English that you can address the CEO and the cleaning lady in the company with basically the same social code, whereas in some languages, people would feel that something is missing, because in their language culture, you address people of authority and people on the same stature as you are, or even lower, with a completely different linguistic structures. And since they cannot do this in English, they feel uncomfortable using English as a language to address authority. And finally, please remember that although technology and the common language connects people and forms teams out of them who must collaborate, and very often they manage to collaborate fairly productively, people will always trust, first of all, other people that they know in person, with whom they have a history. They even know about their character, their hobbies, their lives outside of work, or at least not that, people who share a culture, the same country, the same native language, the same traditions. Building and maintaining trust and a healthy, effective collaboration between people who share these cultural characteristics is always going to be easier than bridging people across several time zones and several locations by technological means. When leaders face complex issues and they must perform to a high level of effectiveness, usually what they reach out to, for example, is their own experience. And this is one of the dangers of this new situation. Because when a leader, let's say, before the pandemic, mostly worked with teams in person, even though if these teams represented different locations, but let's say every quarter or several times every quarter, either the leader could gather together the international leadership team and meet everybody in person, and in between had the opportunity to visit all of these leadership teams and build a personal bond with the key people. In this new world after the pandemic, that is usually not going to be possible. And one of the instincts of the leaders is to work exactly the same way with these virtual teams who span across 8, 9, or 10 time zones as they did in person with teams before the pandemic. And obviously, all that is going to get you is driving you crazy. You cannot read all the emails, you cannot participate in all the meetings, you cannot maintain a personal contact with so many people across so many locations, working with many languages and many traditions as you would with the close leadership team of an international project, let's say 5 years ago. And I know that even many of the books, the videos, and the courses in intercultural skills give confusing advice, suggesting to leaders that they should learn the basics of the language of the people that they lead, to take the trouble to learn the cultural basics of the people who are working with them, and to maintain a cordial, mentoring, personal relationship with the people who are involved in these international projects. And that is fine, for example, in the case of an expat leader who is leaving headquarters and starts working in a distant location, or let's say a leader whose local team involves 2 or 3 nationalities. But if you are put in charge of a project where you are in headquarters or you are in one location and you have to coordinate activities in 3 continents, 5 countries that span 9 time zones, you are going to be unable to be familiar with the languages, the cultures, and the people in these projects, even to a very basic level. Many of the leaders that I work with basically drove themselves crazy just trying to keep up this kind of close personal relationship with hundreds of people across 3 continents. So what is it that you can do to be able to manage teams across multiple time zones more effectively? I think where you can start is noticing the structure of international projects like this. So if you imagine a project like a project chart, which is usually pyramidal in nature because there are fewer people towards the top in leadership positions than at the bottom of the pyramid in the execution and specialist positions, you can see a kind of dividing line in each project. Sometimes it's a little bit higher, closer to the top, and sometimes a little bit lower, closer to technical level. But if you watch the project unfold and you observe people doing their jobs, usually there is some kind of a cultural dividing line within the project. People above this line have a tendency to already have international experience and a certain level of self-confidence working across different locations and different cultures, including with people of authority. People below this level are typically ones with limited or no international experience, very often being a little bit nervous about working with people in distant locations, especially if they have authority, if they are executives, managers, or decision makers. For leaders who try to run projects that span across several time zones without making themselves anxious and sleep deprived, the key is what happens just above and just below this dividing line. People above the dividing line are usually the kind of team that high-level leaders have in mind. People who know each other, people who have a history with each other, people who have more or less the same leadership values. And since they have international experience and they are voluntarily building an international career, these people are willing to work in a foreign language. They are more flexible with their time. For example, the European leader can ask the American colleagues to start their day a little bit earlier and the Asians to finish their day a little bit later so that the team can communicate with each other. And they often follow similar values which are based on the core values, the philosophy or the history of the company itself. People below this dividing line in the project pyramid are much less flexible with any of these options. They might not be so comfortable working in an international language. They might not be that flexible with their working time. And also when it comes to their attitude to work, their attitude to authority, different daily habits when they go to work, when they communicate with each other, when they make decisions, are very different from each other. As, let's say, in our example, this project would involve teams in the United States, in, let's say, Germany, Italy, or other European countries, and let's say China and Indonesia. I think it's easy to see what a diverse array of working styles and cultures this project would involve. People on this level are not consciously building international careers. For them, it's just a job. They are not going to bend over backwards, stay late, and take language classes just so that they can talk to the bosses in another continent. And that is perfectly okay. Many of the leaders I coach had a similar attitude towards their previous companies in an earlier stage of their career. But this is why local leaders, just before these division line, let's say local general managers, team leaders, are so important for those leaders who are coordinating projects that span across several time zones. These are the people who speak the local language, know everybody in those smaller teams in person, and are familiar with the culture of working and collaborating in each of these respective cultures. Leaders who run effective projects and teams across several time zones do not try to be in charge of all of these teams and all of these locations personally. Instead, what they do is they usually work together with the core team towards the top of the project pyramid, and then as they delegate and they cascade tasks and responsibilities downward and they get to this dividing line, first of all, they create subgroups that work in that relevant time zone, or let's say across 2 or 3 time zones. They can encourage these local teams to switch to the local language, follow the daily routine and the time management they are familiar with, and solve problems in their own way with the help of these local leaders as long as the problems get solved. Leaders can manage these teams and sub-teams in a very effective manner. For example, carefully choosing who receives the copies of certain emails and who gets invited to certain meetings. When an important decision must be made about the entire project, the core team, the leadership team towards the top, can discuss different options, then delegate these options down to these local teams, collect recommendations and decisions, analysis, data, whatever is needed. Local leaders can collect this, delegate it up again to the leadership team, and the leadership team can make decisions incorporating all the data and all the suggestions from these teams without having to stay up 24/7 in order to talk to America, Europe, and Asia, without having to make everybody switch to, let's say, English or Chinese or German, and without having to frustrate themselves with the different speeds, the different approaches to authority, the different levels of control, and so on that are involved in these many different cultures across the project. When a leader reaches this point in managing international projects, it is time for some serious self-reflection, because leaders have lots of different options, lots of different choices about how to manage projects across several time zones, and each of these choices are basically a lifestyle decision. Of course, leaders themselves can have very diverse approaches to this, and it's very important for everybody to work according to a style that is aligned with their personal temperament, with their personality. So the leader, him or herself, could be a relative extrovert who enjoys keeping in touch with people, who enjoys, let's say, staying up a little bit later just to catch that one colleague in Kuala Lumpur that she really, really wants to talk to. Or can be a relative introvert who finds this kind of constant human interaction tiring and prefers to communicate with people, let's say, through written means, through emails, or through those local managers via delegation. Naturally, there could be a huge difference between, let's say, an early career high-level leader who is single and doesn't have too many family commitments, or somebody who late career whose kids have already gone off to college and basically they can work as long as they want to, and let's say another leader who has 2 little babies at home, perhaps family members that they have to take care of. So another question is how much time the leader can commit across these different time zones. If it's more, fire away, stay in touch with your team, they will appreciate it. If it's less, draw the line a little bit higher and delegate earlier. And of course, there could be other personal preferences. So imagine an English-speaking leader in the United States of America who in theory wouldn't have to be involved in meetings in Arabic or in Chinese, but the leader happens to speak these languages, happens to want to keep up these languages, and wants to participate in these meetings. That can happen, and that can be very enjoyable, and again, highly appreciated by these local teams, but it's very important to still keep this mental demarcation in mind and not to expect the high-level leadership team also to be able to converse in Mandarin or understand the cultural nuances of Middle Eastern decision-making. It's also important to remember that whereas the leader has a very strong influence on the culture of each of these teams and can work together with these different teams in different ways, the leader never creates the corporate culture of the project, the team, or the company. Cultures grow organically, and they have a tendency to grow from the bottom up. So whichever way the leader chooses, in whichever way the leader chooses to delegate these tasks and appoint the people who play the role of these local leaders just below the dividing line, I recommend that the leader reaches out regularly, at least 3 or 4 times a year, to collect honest feedback, whether the system fulfills its function to all of these teams. And I would delegate most of the collection of feedback to these local leaders, because communicating both problems and solutions in a safe space usually works much better in these small sub-regional or regional cultures and teams who share the same values, share the same language, know each other personally, and know that they can speak honestly with each other. To put this into very, very practical terms, just let me introduce to you 2 leaders that I have recently worked together with as an executive coach. One of them is an Asian lady, comes from a sales background, natural extrovert, natural networker, always full of energy, married. The husband is also high-level executives. Both of them are very, very fully committed to their work, either very ambitious or workaholic, depending on the observer's personal philosophy. They have 2 young kids, but they have a lot of professional and family help with their kids. So basically all they live for is their work, and they seem to be working in all their waking hours, but they tremendously enjoy it. So these are the kind of people who are constantly networking with their teams, constantly on the phone or on a plane. They visit each of the locations that they work with several times a year, and ultimately they gain a lot of pleasure from doing this, because extroverted people, they usually gain energy from interacting with others. Now, it's important to know that everybody delegates something. So the executive I'm introducing to you here is constantly on the phone and constantly on video calls with their teams, but has much less patience with tasks such as data collection, research, detailed discussions, especially long discussions with these regional teams. So these are the tasks that she delegates. You will find it very easy to catch her for a 5-minute video call or a WhatsApp message, but you will find it very difficult to be able to schedule a 1-hour video meeting with her or get an answer to a long email. This would be an example of a high energy, charismatic kind of leadership, which ultimately works across several time zones if the leaders to whom she delegates the more detailed, the more time-consuming tasks are reliable and their cooperation is good enough. Let me contrast that with another leader that I'm working with, who's a gentleman from Europe, comes from a finance background, a very strong analytical finance background, introverted personality, very detail-orientated, perfectionist to the level that some people are afraid, a little bit worried to send their work over to him because he's going to spot that one mistake in the 200-page document. Fairly typical representative of his national culture, tries to work 9 to 5, tries to cut off work immediately and completely after 5 o'clock, or he puts in another hour and a half, but he tries to separate private life from professional life, has 2 young kids at home, likes spending time with the family, and has very, very little flexibility about any of these things. Now, how does somebody like this work across, if I remember correctly, 8 or 9 different time zones? Now, you won't be surprised to hear that this manager is not on the phone or video calls day and nights all the time. His preferred way of communication with his team is not email, which would be already fairly typical for relatively introverted and detail-orientated managers, but database. He believes in putting all the information in a database, delegating tasks to database, getting the results back from database. Everything is transparent. Everything is simple to track. Everything can be opened at any time, 24/7 around the globe. He does this very meticulously. People always know what to expect. And the part that he likes to delegate is exactly the part that this Asian female executive liked to do herself. The video calls, the messages, the face-to-face meetings. Those local teams in 3 different continents have a very vibrant culture within those teams, but he himself is a little bit like somebody in a control tower at the airport. Obviously, completely different leadership style from the previous one, but to be honest with you, it works. One of the things that you may have noticed due to this video is a kind of conceptual shift. Many people, when they have to get used to this kind of multi-time zone, multicultural leadership situation, they start with the tasks. They try to look at how they manage their time differently, how they schedule their meetings differently, how they arrange their business travel differently, who they keep in touch with and who they don't keep in touch with. But I recommend a different approach. Start with your own temperament. Start with your personality, with your preferences. Which are the tasks in your leadership work that you genuinely enjoy and which are the ones that you try to get away from? Especially the 2 kinds of ways to keep in touch with people. Personal, meaning face-to-face, video calls, phone calls, chat messages, and written genres such as email, reports, databases, and so forth. Look at how fast or slow you prefer to work, how structured you want the hierarchy within your teams to be. If you are comfortable working with just a few trusted people, or you enjoy keeping in touch with a wide network. Once you are clear about these, then you are going to be much clearer also about which of the cultures involved are familiar to you or feel comfortable when you work with them, and which are the ones that challenge you or even trigger you on a daily basis. Once you have clarified these things, it's going to be much easier to return back to the tasks and decide according to all of these factors. Do you want to involve everybody in your meetings, or do you want to hold smaller meetings for a carefully selected number of people? Do you want to keep in touch with your core leadership team and with people in different locations through video calls or through emails and so on? At the end of the video, I would like to share with you an extremely useful resource, which is the book called Tribal Leadership. I personally think the title of the book is a little bit unfortunately chosen, because most of the people who hear me mention this book look at me and they don't really like the word tribal, but it's a brilliant handbook for leaders who are trying to build or rebuild teams, especially if there are internal conflicts or dysfunctions in the team at the moment. They take you through 5 levels of developing a team from complete chaos to a very, very high level of collaboration and engagement. And it teaches you one very important lesson that I use on an absolute daily basis. Whenever you want to engage a team, do not start with a team, but with the individual relationships within the team. So find it online, and I hope that you will find it as useful as I did. I hope these thoughts today are relevant to your leadership experience or work experience. Maybe you just want to work a little bit better with your own boss. Check the notes section, because I'm leaving links for example, the book that I recommended just now, and also to how you can contact me if you want to go a little bit further than watching my video and want to work with me as a coach or a consultant. Don't forget to click like and subscribe so that you get my next video first. Find me online and drop me a line.